The dust was a living thing. It coated Clara's tongue, settled in the fine lace of her cuffs, and turned the deep blue of her traveling dress to a muted, weary gray. For 17 days, it had been her most constant companion, a gritty reminder of every mile that separated her from the green, orderly world of her childhood in Massachusetts. That world was gone, sold off piece by piece to settle her father's debts until all that remained of value was her, Clara May Fairchild. 19 years old, polished in letters and needlepoint, was the final asset to be liquidated. Her destination was a town with the unlikely name of Redemption Gulch, and her future was a man she knew only from a single, sepia-toned photograph. Roy Carter. The image had shown a man in his late 40s, his face stern and unsmiling, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. A wealthy rancher, her father had written, his handwriting trembling with a mixture of shame and hope. A widower of good standing. He has paid our debts. Clara, he asks only for a wife to manage his home and provide companionship. It is a good match. You will be safe. Safety felt like a distant country. Every jolt of the stagecoach was a shock to her bones, a violent jostle that echoed the chaos of her new reality. Outside the window, the world was vast and terrifying. The sky was an endless, bleached-out blue, so immense it seemed to press down on the land, crushing it flat. The plains stretched into an eternity of brown grass and shimmering heat, broken only by skeletal trees and strange, looming rock formations that looked like the bones of forgotten giants. She had never known such emptiness. Back home, the world was contained by rolling hills, dense forests, and the neat stone walls that marked one man's property from another. Here, there were no boundaries, no fences, only the raw, unforgiving horizon. It made her feel small and terrifyingly exposed, a single, fragile speck in a world that did not care if she lived or died. The other passengers were 3 men, rough and bearded, who smelled of sweat and cheap whiskey. They gambled with a greasy pack of cards, their voices a low rumble of curses and crude jokes that made Clara's cheeks burn. They had tried to speak to her in the first few days, but her quiet, clipped answers and the way she stared steadfastly out the window soon taught them to leave her be. She was an alien creature here, a pale, soft bird that had strayed too far from its gilded cage. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a halt, its wheels sinking into the thick mud of a wide, unpaved street, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Redemption. Gulch was less a town than a wound on the landscape, a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings slumped against each other as if for support. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, and a handful of other structures lined the street. There was no church steeple, no town square, only a long hitching rail and a wooden water trough where several tired-looking horses stood. Heads bowed. The air hung thick with the smell of manure, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling. People stopped to watch her descend. Faces peered from behind dusty window panes and shadowy doorways. Women in faded calico dresses, their faces etched with lines of hardship, stared with a mixture of pity and resentment. Men in worn denim and sweat-stained hats paused their conversations, their eyes lingering on her fine clothes and the delicate, useless-looking gloves that covered her hands. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, a silent accusation. She was an outsider, a purchase, an object of gossip before she had even spoken a word. Roy Carter was not there to greet her, a lanky boy of about 15, chewing on a piece of straw. Took her single trunk. "Mister, Carter's waiting for you at the Mercantile," he mumbled, not meeting her eye. He led her toward the largest building, the general store, its porch sagging under the weight of barrels and crates. The man who stood in the doorway was the man from the photograph, but the image had not captured the chilling emptiness in his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and cold, and they looked not at her, but through her, as if she were a pane of glass, He was taller than she had expected, with broad, stooped shoulders and large, calloused hands that hung awkwardly at his sides. He wore a simple homespun shirt and dark trousers, clean but worn. There was no smile of welcome, no gesture of comfort. "You are Clara Fairchild," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low, gravelly sound, devoid of warmth. "Yes, Mr. Carter," she whispered, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. He gave a curt nod. "The wagon is out back. We will go." He did not offer to take her arm or help her navigate the muddy street. He simply turned and walked, expecting her to follow. The wagon was old, its wood weathered and splintered. He tossed her trunk into the back with a heavy thud and gestured for her to climb onto the hard wooden seat. The journey from town was silent. Roy Carter handled the horses with brusque efficiency, his gaze fixed on the rugged trail that wound its way up into the pine-covered hills. Clara, sitting beside him, felt an invisible wall between them, a chasm of silence so profound it was almost a noise in itself. She stole glances at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the deep grooves around his mouth, the way his eyes never seemed to blink. He was a man locked inside himself, and he had just turned the key on her as well. The cabin was more remote than she could have imagined, nestled in a small clearing miles from any other sign of life. It was a sturdy but grim structure, built of dark, rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and two small windows that looked like vacant eyes. A thin curl of smoke rose into the air, the only sign of welcome. The silence here was different from the emptiness of the plains. It was a heavy, watchful silence, pressed in by the dense forest of pine and aspen that surrounded the clearing. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and black in the late afternoon sun. As they pulled to a stop, the cabin door opened and a woman emerged. She was tall and severe. Her graying hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut. Her dress was a severe, colorless gray, and her expression was as welcoming as a locked door. "This is Martha," Roy said, his tone flat. "She keeps the house. You will do as she says." Martha's eyes, small and sharp as a bird's, raked over Clara from head to toe. There was no kindness in her gaze, only a cold, dismissive appraisal. "Dinner is at 6. Do not be late. He does not like his food cold." She turned without another word and disappeared back inside. Roy unloaded her trunk and deposited it just inside the door. "Your room is there," he said, pointing to a small door at the end of the main room. "Martha will show you your duties in the morning. I expect a clean house, hot meals, and quiet." And with that, he was gone, heading toward a large barn that stood 100 yards from the cabin. Clara was left standing in the dim, oppressive space, the smell of wood smoke, boiled cabbage, and something old and dusty filling her lungs. The main room served as a kitchen and living area. A large stone hearth dominated one wall. A long wooden table and 2 benches sat in the center, and shelves holding a few tin plates and mugs lined another wall. It was a space stripped of all comfort, all softness. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a place for survival, not for living. Her room was little more than a closet. A narrow bed with a thin mattress and a single coarse blanket was pushed against one wall. A small, 3-legged stool and a wooden crate for her belongings were the only other furniture. The single window was high and small, covered with a piece of oiled parchment that let in a murky, yellow light. A wave of despair so profound it made her physically sick washed over Clara. This was her home. This grim, silent woman and the hollow-eyed man were her family. This suffocating silence was to be the soundtrack of her life. The days that followed fell into a bleak, unchanging routine. She rose before dawn, her breath misting in the cold air, under Martha's critical eye. She learned to cook on the open hearth, her hands, once accustomed to delicate embroidery, becoming chapped and burned. She scrubbed floors, mended Roy's coarse work clothes, hauled water from the well, and tended the small, struggling vegetable garden. Conversation was non-existent. Martha issued orders in a clipped, monotone voice. Roy ate his meals in stony silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. He would leave for the barn before sunrise and return after sunset, smelling of horses and sweat. He never touched Clara, never spoke a word to her that was not a command or a criticism. She was a ghost in his house, a pair of hands to do the work, a presence to be ignored. Once a week, she rode to town with Roy for supplies. The trips were an agony of public humiliation. She sat silently on the wagon seat while he conducted his business, feeling the stares of the townspeople. The whispers followed her down the muddy street. She learned to keep her eyes down, her face a blank mask, but she could not shut out the words. "That's Carter's new wife. Pretty thing, won't last. Looks like a scared rabbit, just like the first one did, at the end." One afternoon, while waiting for Roy outside the general store, she overheard two women talking by a water barrel. Their voices were low, but the wind carried their words to her. "Another fire, you think?" one said, her voice laced with morbid curiosity. "He's got a temper on him," the other replied. "Everyone knows it. Sheriff won't do a thing. Carter owns him, same as he owns that land." "Poor Sarah," the first woman sighed. "To die like that, trapped in her own home. They said the door was barred from the outside." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Sarah, that was his first wife's name. A fire, a door barred from the outside. She looked up at the hills that surrounded the town, at the dark swath of pines where their cabin was hidden. It was not a home. It was a cage. The fear began as a small, cold knot in her stomach and grew with each passing day. She started noticing things she had previously overlooked. The heavy iron bolt on the outside of her bedroom door. She had assumed it was for locking the room from the inside, but a closer inspection revealed it could only be slid shut from the hallway. Why would a lock be on the outside of her door? She tried to write to her family, pouring her loneliness and terror onto the thin pages of stationery she had brought with her. She wrote of the harsh land, the silence, the coldness of her husband. She did not write about the lock or the whispers of fire for fear of what would happen if the letter was found. She sealed the envelopes and gave them to Martha, asking if they might be posted in town. The housekeeper took them without a word, her expression unreadable. Clara knew, with a sickening certainty, that her words would never leave this cabin. They were likely burning in the hearth at that very moment. Roy's moods were a terrifying, unpredictable weather system. Days of cold, silent indifference would suddenly give way to storms of rage, a spilled cup of water, a supper that was a few minutes late, a question he deemed impertinent. Any of these could set him off. He never struck her, but the violence in his eyes was a physical blow. He would stand over her, his voice a low, menacing growl, his big hands clenched into fists at his sides. In those moments, she saw the man who could bar a door and walk away from the screams. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple. Wind howled through the pines, rattling the cabin's shutters. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the small house. Roy had been in a foul temper all day, pacing the main room like a caged animal. He had said nothing, but the air around him crackled with a dangerous energy. After a tense, silent supper, he pulled on a heavy coat. "I'm checking on the horses," he grunted, and slammed the door behind him, leaving Clara alone with Martha. The housekeeper methodically cleaned the dishes, her movements stiff and deliberate. She did not look at Clara, did not acknowledge the storm or the palpable fear in the room. When she was finished, she retired to her own small room near the kitchen, the click of her door shutting echoing in the sudden quiet. Clara felt a profound sense of dread. She retreated to her own room, but she did not undress. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her simple work dress, and listened to the storm. She heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hall, Then the heavy, metallic scrape of the bolt being slid into place on the outside of her door. Her breath caught in her throat. He had locked her in. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled to the door, her hands fumbling for the latch. She pushed, but it was solid, unmoving. "Mr. Carter?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Roy, the door is locked!" There was no answer, only the scream of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. She was a prisoner. The whispers from town came back to her, a chilling chorus in her mind, trapped in her own home. The door was barred from the outside. Exhaustion eventually warred with her fear, and she lay down on the bed, her body rigid, her ears straining for any sound beyond the storm. Sleep came in fitful, nightmarish bursts. She dreamed of fire, of suffocating heat and choking smoke. She awoke with a gasp, coughing. The dream clung to her, thick and acrid. But the smell was not a dream. It was real. Smoke. It was faint at first, a thin, sharp scent that curled under her locked door. Her eyes flew open in the darkness. She could hear a strange crackling sound, like dry leaves being crushed, but it was louder, angrier. She threw herself off the bed and pressed her face to the crack at the bottom of the door. The smoke was thicker there, and she could see a terrifying, flickering orange light dancing in the main room. "Fire!" she screamed, beating on the door with her fists. "Help! Somebody! Help me! The house is on fire!" Her own voice sounded small and desperate against the roar of the storm and the growing roar of the flames. The smoke was pouring in now, thick and black, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. She coughed, a deep, racking cough that doubled her over. The heat was becoming intense. The wooden door warmed to the touch. He had done it. He had locked her in and set the cabin ablaze, just as they whispered he had done to Sarah. He had left her to burn. Panic gave way to a primal, frantic terror. She threw the small stool at the window, but it bounced off the sturdy wooden shutters. She was going to die here, choking on smoke in a locked room, her body consumed by the flames of her husband's hatred. She sank to the floor, gasping for the cleaner air near the boards, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. The simple cotton dress she had chosen for her wedding day, now worn thin and gray from work, felt like a shroud. Suddenly, a tremendous crash splintered the air. The front door of the cabin burst inward. Through the swirling smoke and roaring flames, she saw a figure, a man silhouetted against the inferno. He was not Roy. This man was leaner, quicker. He moved with a purpose that was born of something other than malice. "In here!" she shrieked, her voice raw. Another crash, and her own door shuddered on its hinges, then flew open, torn away by a powerful kick. A man stood there, a wet bandana covering the lower half of his face. His eyes, clear and steady in the firelight, found hers. He moved toward her, seemingly oblivious to the burning rafters that threatened to collapse around them. He pulled a thick horse blanket from his shoulder, wrapped it around her, and scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Clara buried her face in his chest, inhaling the clean, rain-soaked scent of his shirt amidst the choking smoke. He carried her through the hellish main room, sparks and embers raining down around them. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin. He did not hesitate, his stride long and sure as he burst back out into the raging storm. He carried her clear of the burning cabin, out into the lashing rain and the blessed, clean air. He set her down gently under the shelter of a large pine tree, pulling the bandana from his face. He was a stranger, a man with a quiet, weathered face and haunted eyes that seemed to hold a sorrow as vast as the western sky. The cabin was fully engulfed now, a monstrous torch against the black, stormy night. The roof groaned and collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks toward the heavens. Clara stared, mesmerized by the horror. Then the reality of what had happened crashed down on her. The lock, The smoke, the certainty of a terrible, fiery death. A sob broke from her, then another, until she was weeping uncontrollably, her body shaking with a violent, bone-deep tremor. She was alive, but the terror was still inside her, burning hotter than any flame. The stranger knelt beside her, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. He said nothing, simply stayed, a silent witness to her despair. Through her tears, she looked from the fire back to him, this cowboy who had walked out of the storm and into a nightmare to save her. Soot from the fire had blackened her thin dress, the one she had foolishly thought of as her wedding dress, turning the pale fabric to a mottled ruin of gray and black. She sobbed, not with relief, but with the raw, ragged pain of a creature who has only just escaped the jaws of a trap. He did not speak as he led his horse through the driving rain. With her mounted in the saddle, the world was a maelstrom of wind, water, and darkness, punctuated by the hellish orange glow of the burning cabin receding behind them. Clara clung to the saddle horn, the borrowed blanket wrapped tightly around her, her body racked with shivers that were only partly from the cold. Each thunderclap felt like a gunshot, each flash of lightning a glimpse of the nightmare she had just escaped. The man, this stranger, walked with a steady, relentless pace, his hand on the horse's bridle, navigating the treacherous, muddy trail as if he could see in the dark. His ranch was a small, sheltered pocket carved out of the wilderness, nestled between two high, rocky ridges that blunted the force of the wind. A simple log cabin, much smaller than Roy's, stood beside a well-built corral and a small barn. It looked solid, safe, a refuge from the storm. He led the horse into the barn, the air inside warm and sweet with the smell of hay and animal life. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and surprisingly gentle on her arms as he steadied her trembling legs. Inside the cabin, a low fire was already glowing in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the single room. It was a sparse, masculine space, but it was clean and orderly. A narrow bed was built into one wall. A sturdy table and two chairs stood in the center, and shelves held a few books, tin plates, and neatly folded blankets. He gestured for her to sit in the chair by the fire and then moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency. He added a log to the fire, filled a kettle with water from a bucket, and hung it on a hook over the flames. He did all this without a word, his movements economical and precise. Clara watched him, her fear warring with an immense, overwhelming gratitude. She was alive. The thought was so staggering, so impossible, that it kept repeating itself in her mind. He brought her a tin mug of hot water, a precious bit of sugar stirred into it. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold it. He noticed, and his expression softened for the first time. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and calm. It was the first time he had spoken since pulling her from the fire. He found a small wooden box and brought it to the hearth, opening it to reveal salves and clean linen strips. "You have some burns," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "On your arms? Let me see." She numbly held out her arms. Angry red welts were rising on her skin where embers had landed. He gently cleaned the burns with a damp cloth and applied a cool, soothing salve that smelled of pine and herbs. His touch was careful, impersonal, but the simple act of care was so foreign, so unexpected, that it brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he wrapped the worst of the burns in clean linen. He then rose and went to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a man's homespun shirt and a pair of worn denim trousers. He laid them on the chair beside her. "They'll be too big," he said, his back to her, giving her a measure of privacy. "But they're dry. Your dress is ruined." She looked down at the soot-blackened, scorched fabric of her dress, her wedding dress. The thought was so absurd it was almost laughable. She changed clumsily, her fingers stiff and numb, the rough, clean clothes swallowing her small frame. The shirt smelled faintly of wood smoke and soap. It smelled like him. When she was done, he turned back, his gaze lingering for a moment on the small, huddled figure she made in his oversized clothes before he looked away. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. The storm outside was beginning to subside, its fury spent. In its place, a heavy, oppressive quiet settled over Clara's heart. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Why did you help me?" He stared into the flames, his profile etched in firelight. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. "I live up on the ridge," he said at last, his voice rough. "Saw the smoke against the storm. Heard the screaming." It was a simple, logical answer, but it did not explain the look in his eyes. She had seen it in the fire, and she saw it now in the quiet of his cabin. It was a deep, familiar sorrow, the look of a man who had seen his own world burn to the ground. There was more to his story. She knew, just as there was more to hers. "He locked me in," she said, the words tumbling out on a ragged breath. "My husband, he bolted the door from the outside." The man's jaw tightened, but he showed no surprise. He simply nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "My name is Clara," she offered, needing to fill the silence, to assert her own existence in the face of annihilation. "Eli Morgan," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the fire. He gave her his bed that night, insisting he would take the floor by the hearth. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames, smelled the smoke, felt the terrifying finality of the locked door. She lay shivering under the coarse blankets, listening to the man's steady breathing from the floor, a comforting, solid presence in the darkness. A few days later, the burns on her arms beginning to heal, Eli rode into Redemption Gulch for supplies. He was gone for hours, and, in his absence, the silence of the cabin pressed in on Clara, a suffocating weight. She thought of her family, of their letters that were never sent, of the life she had been promised versus the one she had been given. When Eli returned, his face was grim. He unpacked the supplies, flour, coffee, beans, without speaking. Finally, as he was putting away a small sack of salt, he broke the silence. "The town is talking," he said, his back still to her. "Roy Carter is telling everyone you ran off, took what you could and left in the middle of the night with a drifter. He's playing the part of the wronged husband." Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Of course, he would not admit to what he had done. He would turn her into the villain, the fallen woman. "The women," Eli continued, his voice tight with contempt. "They sneer at your name. The sheriff, a man named Brody, he just shrugged, said it's a domestic affair, not his concern." The last of her hope withered and died. No one would help her. No one would believe her. In the eyes of the world, she was a faithless wife, a common thief. She was whatever Roy Carter said she was. That night, as they sat by the fire, the truth poured out of her. She told him everything. She told him about her family's poverty, about the arranged marriage, about the photograph of the stern-faced man who was her only introduction to her future. She described the cold, silent journey from town, the grim, loveless cabin, and the watchful, disapproving eyes of the housekeeper, Martha. She told him about the lock on the outside of her door, about the missing letters, about Roy's sudden, violent tempers that erupted from nowhere. She spoke of the whispers she had overheard in town, about his first wife, Sarah, and the fire that had taken her life. "I knew I was going to die there," she whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "From the moment I arrived. I felt it. I was just waiting for him to decide how." Eli listened, his expression unreadable, his gaze never leaving her face. When she was finished, a great, shuddering silence filled the room. He got up and poured them both a mug of coffee. his movements slow and deliberate. "I knew Roy Carter," he said, his voice low. He handed her a mug and sat back down, cradling his own in his large hands. "A long time ago. We drove cattle up from Texas together, more than once." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He was always a hard man, quick to anger, but there was a darkness in him, a cruelty that went beyond a simple temper. The other men, they kept their distance. He had a reputation for holding a grudge, for settling scores in the quiet places out on the trail." Eli took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes dark with memory. "I was in the territory when his first wife died. I heard the story, a terrible accident. They said a lamp overturned, but I never believed it. Roy wasn't careless, and he was greedy. That ranch, the land, it had all belonged to her family. With her gone, it was all his." He looked at Clara, his gaze direct and filled with a grim understanding. "I believe you, Clara. I believe he killed her, and I believe he tried to kill you." The simple words, "I believe you," were a balm to her shattered soul. It was the first time anyone in this harsh, unforgiving land had offered her anything other than judgment or indifference. The relief was so profound it made her weak. "I cannot go back," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not. I would rather die in these hills than let him touch me again." "I know," Eli said quietly. He was silent for a long time, staring into the depths of the fire. Clara held her breath, her entire future hanging on his next words. He was her only hope, the single thread she clung to over a bottomless abyss. "You can stay here," he said finally, not looking at her. "For now, until you heal, until we can figure out what to do next. But you need to understand, the town won't help you. If Roy comes looking, the law will be on his side. To them, you are his property." The offer was a lifeline, but his warning was a cold dose of reality. She was safe, but she was also a fugitive. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled in the small cabin. Clara began to heal, not just from her burns, but from the deeper wounds of fear and isolation. She watched Eli, trying to understand the quiet, solitary man who had saved her. He was a man of routines. He rose with the sun, tended his few horses, mended fences, and worked the small plot of land where he grew his own food. He moved with a quiet competence, at home in the wilderness that had so terrified her. But there was a sadness about him, a permanent shadow in his eyes that even the brightest morning sun could not dispel. Sometimes she would see him staring off at the distant peaks, his face a mask of old pain. In those moments, she sensed that his solitude was not a choice, but a penance. His past would come to him in flashes, sharp and unwelcome. Mending a leather strap, he would suddenly see his younger brother, Jacob, laughing as he fumbled with a new saddle, the sun catching the gold in his hair. The memory would be so vivid he could almost smell the trail dust, hear the lowing of the cattle. Then it would shift, the image twisting into a nightmare of gun smoke. The surprised look on Jacob's face, the dark red stain spreading across his chest during a cattle raid that had gone wrong. Eli had been there. He had held his brother as the life faded from him, and the guilt of surviving had been his constant companion ever since. Other times, the scent of the pine trees after a rain would bring back the memory of Amelia. He remembered her small, cool hand in his, the way she had smelled of lavender and soap. They had planned to buy a small farm, to build a life far from the violence of the cattle trails. Then the fever had come, swift and merciless. He had nursed her, boiled herbs, prayed to a God he no longer believed in. But she had wasted away before his eyes. He had buried her himself, on a small hill overlooking a creek, and a part of him had been buried with her. The world had taken everyone he had ever loved. Isolation was not a choice. It was a shield. One evening, another storm blew in, a smaller echo of the one that had almost claimed her life. The wind moaned around the corners of the cabin, and the rain beat a frantic rhythm on the roof. The sound brought the terror of that night rushing back to Clara. She saw the flames, heard the roar, felt the suffocating heat. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. A violent tremor seized her body. She stood up from her chair by the fire, a choked cry escaping her lips. She could not bear to be alone with the memories. Without thinking, she crossed the small room and stumbled into Eli. She collapsed against his chest, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, her body shaking uncontrollably. "He was going to let me die?" she sobbed, her words muffled against his chest. He locked the door and he walked away. Eli froze. His entire body went rigid, his arms stiff at his sides. For a long moment, he did not move, his instincts screaming at him to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude. To touch her, to comfort her, was to let her in, and letting anyone in meant risking the agony of loss all over again. But he could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his own chest, feel the desperate, terrified trembling of her body. He heard the raw, unvarnished pain in her voice. He had seen too much death, too much suffering, to turn away. The man who had walked into a burning building for a stranger could not abandon this broken woman in his arms. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his arms and wrapped them around her. It was an awkward, unpracticed gesture, but it was an embrace nonetheless. He held her, his hand resting gently on the back of her head, offering his own solid presence as an anchor in her storm of memory. He did not speak. He just held her as she wept, her fear and gratitude and loneliness pouring out of her in a cleansing, heartbreaking flood. He held her through the night, a silent guardian, as the storm outside passed, leaving the world washed clean and quiet in its wake. The night of the storm had broken something open between them. In the days that followed, a new awareness settled into the small cabin, as tangible as the scent of pine smoke from the hearth. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a fragile routine built over a chasm of unspoken things. The silence that had once been a neutral space was now charged with a low, humming tension. They worked side by side, their movements a kind of spare, unconscious choreography. When they repaired a length of fence on the high meadow, he would hold the post steady while she handed him the nails, their fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric moment. When they hauled water from the well, they would fall into a natural cadence, one pulling while the other guided the rope. In the evenings, she would cook while he sharpened his tools by the fire, the scrape of steel on the stone a counterpoint to the gentle sizzle of food in the skillet. They spoke little, but they were always watching. Eli, a man accustomed to solitude, found himself observing Clara with a reluctant fascination. He had rescued a victim, a terrified woman in a ruined dress. But the woman who now moved about his cabin was not merely a victim. He saw a strength in her that was as quiet and resilient as the ancient pines that clung to the rocky ridges. He watched her hands, once the pale, soft hands of an Eastern lady, slowly become chapped and calloused. She never complained. When she burned her hand on the skillet, she flinched, ran it under the cool water from the pump, and then returned to her cooking, her mouth set in a firm line. He saw her trying to learn the land that had so terrified her. She would ask him the names of the wildflowers that grew in stubborn clusters in the meadow. Her brow furrowed as she repeated the words, Indian paintbrush, columbine, fireweed. He once found her at the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still, watching a doe and its fawn. She had not made a sound, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. And in that moment, she seemed less an intruder and more a part of the landscape. In the evenings, she would read. He owned only a dozen books, a worn copy of Shakespeare, a book on animal husbandry, several volumes of poetry, and a well-thumbed Bible. She would sit on the floor by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light, and lose herself in their pages. He would watch her from his chair, seeing the faraway look in her eyes, and realized that she possessed an inner world he could not access, a place of learning and refinement that stood in stark contrast to the raw simplicity of his own life. He had saved her body from the fire, but he was beginning to see that her spirit was something she alone was responsible for saving, and she was doing it with a quiet, stubborn grace that humbled him. Clara, in turn, began to see the man behind the silent, stoic rescuer. She discovered his gentleness in the small, unguarded moments of his day. She saw it in the way he tended his horses, his rough hands moving with a surprising delicacy as he curried their coats, his voice a low, soothing murmur that was softer than any tone he ever used with her. He had a big bay gelding named Solomon that would nuzzle his shoulder and search his pockets for a bit of apple. And the affection between man and beast was a simple, honest thing that touched a place deep inside her. His solitude, she began to realize, was not born of misanthropy, but of a deep and abiding pain. His avoidance of town was more than a preference. It was a necessity. He belonged to these hills, to the silence and the wildness. The world of men, with its laws and judgments, was a foreign country to him. In the evenings, after their meal was done, he would sometimes take a piece of pine or aspen and a small, sharp knife and carve. He would work for hours, the shavings falling onto the hearth, his concentration absolute. He carved little animals, a hawk with its wings outstretched, a reclining deer, a bear cub in motion. The figures were breathtakingly liffey-like, imbued with a spirit and grace that seemed impossible to draw from a simple block of wood. She saw in those small carvings the heart of the man, a quiet, patient, creative soul that had been buried under layers of grief and hardship. He was gentle. She realized, not because he was weak, but because he had known so much violence that he had consciously chosen to cultivate its opposite. Their fragile peace was shattered on a trip to town. Their supplies were running low, and Eli knew he could not put it off any longer. The ride to Redemption Gulch was tense. Clara, wearing one of his old shirts and a borrowed, wide-brimmed hat to shadow her face, felt the familiar dread return as they descended from the hills. The town looked just as bleak and unwelcoming as it had the day she arrived. Eli tied Solomon to the hitching rail outside the general store. "Stay with the horse," he said, his voice low. "I will not be long." But he had barely stepped onto the porch when two men emerged from the saloon next door. They were rough-looking, their faces flushed with drink. Clara recognized them as men who sometimes worked for Roy Carter. One of them, a burly man with a thick, unkempt beard, caught sight of her. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here," he slurred, swaggering toward the horse. "If it isn't Carter's runaway bride. Heard you had a taste for the wildlife." His partner, a smaller, weaselly man, snickered. "Roy's been missing his property. Says he aims to get it back." Clara's blood ran cold. She shrank back in the saddle, pulling the hat down further. The burly man reached out and grabbed the horse's bridle, his knuckles brushing her leg. "No need to be shy, little lady. We'll take you back to your husband. He'll be real grateful." Before the man could take another step, Eli was there. He moved with a speed that was shocking in its suddenness. He said nothing. His hand shot out, grabbing the front of the man's shirt and twisting it, pulling him forward. Eli's other fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening, wet crack. The man crumpled to the ground, out cold. The smaller man stared, his mouth agape, then fumbled for the pistol at his hip. Eli turned on him, his eyes like chips of ice. The man's bravado evaporated. He took a step back, then another, before turning and scrambling back into the saloon. The street had gone quiet. People were watching from doorways and windows. Eli stood over the unconscious man, his chest heaving, his hands clenched. He looked up and his eyes met Clara's. She saw no triumph in his face, only a weary, familiar anger and a deep, profound regret. A door opened and the sheriff, a portly, lazy-looking man with a stained vest and a drooping mustache, ambled onto the street. He looked at the man on the ground, at Eli, and at Clara. He sighed, as if this were a great personal inconvenience. "Morgan," he said, his voice tired. "What is this?" "He was threatening my companion," Eli said, his voice a low growl. The sheriff's eyes drifted to Clara, his gaze dismissive and faintly contemptuous. "That there is Roy Carter's wife. You have no business with her. You have been told to stay out of town." "She is under my protection," Eli stated, his voice flat and unyielding. The sheriff shook his head slowly, a look of pitying disdain on his face. "Son, you need to stop playing hero. It will not end well for you. That woman belongs with her husband. Now, I suggest you get on your horse and ride out of here before I decide to lock you up for assault. And leave her here." Eli did not move. For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other. The sheriff was a man who represented the law, but it was a lazy, corrupted law. Eli was a man who lived by his own code, a code that had just been violated, finally, with a visible effort. Eli unclenched his fists. He walked to Solomon, untied the reins, and swung himself up into the saddle behind Clara. He gave the sheriff one last hard look. "She is not his property," he said, and with a click of his tongue, he turned the horse and rode out of town, leaving the unconscious man lying in the mud. The ride back to the cabin was steeped in a heavy, wounded silence. The sanctuary of their isolation had been breached. The ugliness of the world had found them. That night, the dam of Clara's composure finally broke. She sat huddled by the fire, staring into the flames that had once been her greatest terror but were now a source of comfort. The events of the day played over and over in her mind, the leering faces of the men, the casual contempt in the sheriff's eyes, the cold, hard fact that in the eyes of the law and this community, she was not a person, but an object to be returned to its owner. "Why?" she cried out, the word torn from the very depths of her soul. She looked at Eli, her eyes swimming with tears of rage and despair. "Why does no one care that he tried to burn me alive? Why does the whole world protect him and condemn me? What did I do to deserve this?" Eli had no answers. He could face down two men in a street, but he could not fight the ingrained prejudices of an entire society. He could offer her his home, but he could not offer her justice. He moved to her side, kneeling before her, his expression a mask of shared pain. He reached out and took her hands, his grip firm and steady. "I care," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I care." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words. He was the only one, the only person in this vast, cruel wilderness who saw her, who believed her, who valued her life. The realization, coupled with the raw emotion of the day, was too much to bear. A sob escaped her, and she leaned forward, into him. And then he was kissing her. It was not a tender kiss. It was not gentle or sweet. It was desperate, raw, and broken. It was a kiss born of shared loneliness and a furious defiance of the world that had tried to crush them both. It was the frantic, searching kiss of two people who had been starved for a single, honest, human connection. His lips were rough against hers, and his hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. She clung to him, her hands gripping his arms, her tears mingling with the salt on his skin. It was a kiss of gratitude, of fear, of a sudden, startling hunger she had never known she possessed. It was a protest, a confession, a prayer in the dark. For a long, breathless moment, they were lost in it. Then, as suddenly as it began, the reality of their situation crashed down upon them. Clara pulled back, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The air between them was electric, dangerous. "I am still someone's wife," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the truth. The law, the church, the world, all said she belonged to Roy Carter. The light in Eli's eyes died. A look of shame and conflict washed over his face, as if he had just broken a sacred vow to himself. He stood up abruptly, his movement stiff and awkward. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then turned without a word. He strode to the door, grabbed a heavy coat from a peg, and walked out into the cold, dark night. Clara was left alone by the fire, her lips still tingling, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard the sound of his horse's hooves, galloping away, fading into the immense, silent darkness of the hills. He was running. She knew, not from her, but from the terrifying, complicated emotion that had just exploded between them. Eli was gone for 2 days. He returned near dusk on the second day, a lone figure on his horse appearing out of the deepening shadows of the valley. He did not look at Clara as he dismounted and began to unsaddle Solomon, his movements stiff and deliberate. The air in the cabin that night was thick with unspoken words. The desperate, hungry kiss they had shared was a ghost between them, a question that neither dared to answer. They ate in silence, the space around the small table feeling vast and empty. The news from the outside world arrived a week later, carried by a grizzled old trapper who sometimes passed through the high country. He stopped for a cup of coffee and, in exchange, offered up the latest gossip from Redemption Gulch. "Roy Carter's put a warrant out on you. Morgan," the trapper said, peering at Eli over the rim of his tin mug. "Filed a legal complaint. Says you kidnapped his wife." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the fire. "Sheriff Brody ain't too keen on coming up into these hills to serve it. But the paper exists. Carter's offering a reward, $50. Eli's face remained a stony mask, but Clara felt a fresh wave of cold fear. A warrant, kidnapping, the law, which had ignored her attempted murder, was now being twisted into a weapon to hunt her down. After the trapper had gone, the silence he left behind was heavier than ever. That night, Clara knew the silence had to be broken. She waited until the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Eli sat in his chair, staring into the coals, lost in a world of his own. "Eli," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He did not look at her. "That kiss, I was not afraid of you. I was afraid of what I was feeling." He remained motionless, his jaw set like granite. She took a deep breath, the words she had been holding in her heart finally spilling out. "I do not know what this is. I have never felt anything like it before. But I know that when I am with you, I am not just a piece of property. I am me. I am Clara. And I think," she faltered, her voice trembling with the enormity of the confession, "I think I am falling in love with you." At that, he finally moved. He turned his head slowly and looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "Do not say that," he said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "You do not know me. You do not know what I have done." "I know you saved my life," she insisted, moving to kneel on the floor beside his chair. "Saving a life does not wash you clean," he said, his gaze turning inward, to the dark places she could not see. "Clara, I have blood on my hands. From years ago, on a cattle drive, my brother, he was killed in an ambush. Rustlers, I survived, and I hunted them down, one by one. It was not justice, it was vengeance. It was cold and it was ugly, and it left a mark on me that will never go away." He looked down at his own hands as if they were foreign objects, stained with a guilt she could not comprehend. "Everything I touch, I ruin. Everyone I have ever cared for is gone. I live up here for a reason. I am no good for you. I am not a second chance. I am a dead end." His words were meant to be a wall, a final, insurmountable barrier between them. But Clara heard the truth beneath the self-loathing. She heard the voice of a man drowning in grief, a man who believed he was unworthy of a single moment of happiness. She reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough and calloused, but she could feel a tremor running through him. "My family sold me to a man who tried to burn me alive," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The law protects him. The town condemns me. I have nothing left of the person I was. I do not need a clean slate. Eli, I do not need a saint. I just need you." His resolve shattered. A single hard tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He looked at her, his defenses crumbling, and saw not an accuser, but a fellow survivor. He saw a woman whose strength was forged in the same fires that had consumed his own past. Slowly, he leaned in, and this time, the kiss was different. It was soft, hesitant, a question and an answer all in one. He tasted of coffee and sorrow, and she tasted of wood smoke and a desperate, burgeoning hope. They shared their secrets then, in the quiet intimacy of the firelight. He told her about Jacob, his laughing younger brother who had died in his arms. He spoke of Amelia, the girl he was to marry, whose grave he had dug with his own hands after the typhoid fever took her. He unburdened a lifetime of guilt and loss. In turn, she told him of her life in the East, of the stifling expectations and the quiet desperation of a family sliding into poverty. She spoke of her love for books and poetry, a world of beauty and order that had been ripped away from her. They laid their broken pieces out before each other, and in the shared wreckage, they found a sense of wholeness. Later, he led her to his bed, outside. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, thick, silent flakes that muffled the world, creating a cocoon of privacy around the small cabin. He undressed her slowly, with a reverence that made her feel cherished, not used. His hands, which she had seen gentle a nervous horse and carve life from a block of wood, were just as tender on her skin. He made love to her not with the raw desperation of their first kiss, but with a quiet awe, as if he were rediscovering a forgotten language. For Clara, it was a revelation. With Roy, she had braced for a violation, an act of ownership that had never come. With Eli, there was no fear. There was only the profound, staggering relief of being truly seen, of being held, of being safe. As she lay in his arms, the snow falling softly outside the window, she listened to the steady beat of his heart against her ear. It was the first night in months, perhaps the first night of her entire life, that she had felt completely and utterly safe. Their new intimacy, however, did not shield them from the world. On his next trip for supplies, Eli was met with open hostility. The preacher, Reverend Miller, had apparently delivered a sermon on the sins of adultery, his words a thinly veiled attack on the fallen woman living in the hills with a man who was not her husband. The women of the town, who had once looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and resentment, now stared with undisguised contempt. At the general store, the proprietor, a man who had known Eli for years, refused to sell him supplies. "I cannot, Eli," he said, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. "My wife, the Reverend. People are talking. It is bad for business." Eli left with nothing but a sack of flour he had gotten from a sympathetic blacksmith in exchange for sharpening a set of tools. Their isolation was now complete. They were outlaws, not of the gun-toting variety, but of the heart. Clara, cut off from her past and shunned by her present, found a new way to speak. She discovered an old, leather-bound ledger among Eli's books, its pages mostly empty. She began to write, not letters to a family who would never receive them, but a journal. She filled the pages with the elegant, looping script she had been taught in finishing school, but the words were no longer those of a polished young lady. They were the words of a woman being forged anew in the wilderness. She wrote about the colors of the sunset on the high peaks, about the surprising strength in her own hands, about the quiet kindness of the man who slept beside her. She described the fear that was her constant companion, but also the fierce, stubborn joy she found in a shared cup of coffee at dawn. "I am not who I was," she wrote one evening, the pen scratching in the quiet cabin. "That girl, the one who stepped off the stagecoach, she is a stranger to me now. She was made of lace and fear. I think I am being remade, of pine and rock and fire. The quiet rhythm of their days was shattered one cold, clear morning. Clara had gone to the well to fetch water. As she looked up at the ridge that sheltered their valley, she saw a flicker of movement. She froze, her hand on the cold rope of the well. Two men on horseback were silhouetted against the morning sky, their figures small but unmistakable. They were watching the cabin. Roy's men. She ran back inside, her heart pounding. "Eli, on the ridge! 2 men!" He was at the door in an instant, his eyes scanning the high ground. He saw them, too. His face was grim. "They are scouting, looking for a way down." He turned to her, his expression urgent. "Clara, you have to go. There is a game trail on the other side of the valley. It leads up into the high country. Take Solomon. I will lead them away, down toward the South Canyon." Panic seized her, the thought of leaving him, of being alone again in that vast, terrifying wilderness, was unbearable. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not leave you." "You must," he insisted, his hands gripping her shoulders. "He wants you. If I am alone, they have no reason to stay. You will be safe." "I am not safe without you," she cried, her fear giving way to a fierce, protective anger. "My safety is not the only thing that matters. Eli, yours does too. I will not be sent away like a child. I am staying with you." He looked at her, at the raw determination in her eyes, and he saw that the frightened girl he had pulled from the fire was truly gone. In her place was a woman who would not be broken, who would not run. He gave a short, sharp nod. "All right, but stay inside. Bar the door behind me." He took a rifle from the pegs on the wall and a pistol, which he tucked into his belt. He moved out of the cabin with a quiet, predatory grace, melting into the trees at the edge of the clearing. Clara barred the heavy door and waited, her ear pressed against the rough wood, her entire being focused on the silence outside. The hours crawled by. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. The silence was a torment, a blank canvas on which her imagination painted terrifying pictures. She heard nothing, no shouts, no gunshots, just the wind in the pines. It was nearly dusk when he returned. He stumbled through the door, his face pale and drawn, his left sleeve soaked in blood. A deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder to his elbow. He had a new set of bruises on his face, and he moved with a weary stiffness that spoke of a brutal fight. "They are gone," he said, his voice strained as he sank into a chair by the hearth. "For now. There was a scuffle. They were not expecting me to come at them from above." Clara rushed to his side, her fear replaced by a focused, urgent need to help. She fetched the box of salves and linen, her hands moving quickly and efficiently. She gently cut away the blood-soaked sleeve, revealing the ugly, deep wound beneath. Her stomach churned, but she pushed the feeling down. He had cared for her burns, now she would care for his wound. She cleaned the gash as he had taught her to clean her own scrapes, with boiled water and a clean cloth. He winced, his breath hissing between his teeth, but he did not make a sound. She found a needle and strong thread in her small sewing kit. Her hands were shaking as she threaded it. She had mended his shirts, but she had never put a stitch in human flesh. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice low. "Yes," she said, her own voice surprisingly steady as she met his gaze. "I do." She worked by the light of the fire, her stitches small and neat, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her, his expression a mixture of pain and wonder. He had tried to send her away, to protect her, but here she was, tending to his wounds, her shaking hands a testament not to her fear, but to her courage. She was not leaving. They were in this together, and as she tied the final knot and began to bandage his arm, they both knew, without a word being spoken, that the fight for their lives had just begun. Winter came down from the high peaks, not as a gentle blanket of white, but as an invading army, It laid siege to the small cabin, its relentless winds whining at the corners of the logs, its bitter cold finding every crack and seam. The world shrank to the confines of their small clearing, a pocket of fragile life in a vast, sleeping wilderness. Their supplies dwindled with an alarming speed. Coffee became a luxury, then a memory. Sugar was gone. They rationed the last of the flour and beans, their meals becoming spare and repetitive. The physical hardship was a constant, grinding reality. The ground was frozen iron hard, and the simple act of chopping wood became a battle. Eli, his arm still healing and stiff, could not swing the axe with his usual force. Clara, seeing his grimaces of pain, took up the second axe. At first, her swings were clumsy, the shock of the impact jarring her from her hands to her shoulders. Blisters rose on her palms, broke, and bled. But she did not stop. Day after day, she worked beside him, her face set in a mask of determination. The blisters became calluses. Her arms, once slender and pale, grew sinewy and strong. They were a team, united against the slow, cold starvation of the winter. Their tense hiding was a psychological war. Every snap of a frozen branch in the woods, every howl of a distant wolf, sent a jolt of fear through them. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary, their gazes constantly scanning the ridges, waiting for the inevitable return of Roy Carter's men. The passion they had discovered had not vanished, but it was banked, like embers under ash, suppressed by the constant, gnawing anxiety. They moved with a quiet, careful tenderness around each other, a shared look or a brief touch of hands, a small act of rebellion against the fear. Down in Redemption Gulch, Roy Carter's fury festered. The reward he had offered had yielded nothing. The few men he had sent into the hills had returned bruised and empty-handed, with stories of a ghost who fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. Roy, a man whose power was built on control and intimidation, could not abide this defiance. He owned the land, he owned the law, and he would own his wife. He stormed into Sheriff Brody's office, his face a thundercloud of rage, and threw a heavy purse of gold coins onto the desk. It was not a request. It was a command. The law would do his bidding. Sheriff Brody, a man whose laziness was surpassed only by his greed, finally relented. He gathered a posse of a dozen men, drawn from the saloon's regulars and Carter's own ranch hands, men who were bored, or cruel, or simply in need of the money. They were not men of justice. They were a pack of hounds given a scent. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of cold, orange light, they rode out of town, torches held high, their lights like angry fireflies against the darkening hills. Their stated purpose was to rescue a stolen bride. Their true purpose was to burn a renegade out of his hiding place. Eli knew they were coming before he saw them. He felt it in the unnatural silence of the forest, the absence of the usual night sounds. He stood at the edge of the clearing, sniffing the air, his body taut. Then he saw it, a faint, flickering orange glow on the far side of the valley. Torches. He moved back to the cabin, his face a grim, emotionless mask that did not fool Clara for a second. He began to gather things with a swift, desperate purpose. He took a worn leather satchel and filled it with what little food they had left. A strip of dried venison, a handful of hard biscuits. He filled a canteen with water. He laid out a heavy wool blanket. Then, he went to the wooden chest at the foot of his bed and took out an old revolver, its wooden handle worn smooth, its steel barrel a dull gray. He checked the cylinder, his movements economical and practiced. He handed the gun to Clara, closing her trembling fingers around the grip. "This was my brother's," he said, his voice low and tight. "It is a Colt Peacemaker. It is loaded. To fire it, you pull the hammer back, and you pull the trigger. Do not hesitate." He pushed a small handful of extra cartridges into the pocket of her trousers. He took her outside, into the biting cold, and led Solomon from the barn. The horse was already saddled. "There is a map in the saddlebag," he said, his voice a strained whisper as he helped her mount. "It shows a hidden trail through the Blackwood Pass. It will lead you west, to the next territory. No one knows you there. You can sell the horse. You can start again." The reality of what he was doing crashed down on her. He was sending her away, alone. The thought was a physical blow, more terrifying than any posse. "No," she said, shaking her head, the single word a small, desperate plea. "Eli, no, I am not leaving you." "They are coming for you, Clara," he insisted, his hands gripping the saddle, his face upturned to hers, his expression ravaged with a pain she had never seen before. "If you are gone, this ends. I can lose them in these hills, but I cannot protect you and fight them at the same time." Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She looked at him, this quiet, gentle man who had saved her, who had shown her a kindness she had never known, and the prospect of riding away, of leaving him to face a dozen armed men alone, was an agony beyond imagining. She remembered the first fire, the locked door, the absolute certainty of dying alone. This felt the same. This was another kind of burning. She slid from the saddle, back onto the frozen ground, and threw her arms around his neck, clinging to him with all her strength. "Please," she sobbed, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. "Please don't leave me burning." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. He understood. He was asking her to do the one thing she could not bear, to face the fire alone again. His resolve crumbled. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his body racked with a silent, terrible shudder. He had tried to do the right thing, the honorable thing, to save her at the cost of himself. But her love was a force more powerful than his own guilt. "All right," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with unshed tears. "All right, Clara, we stay together." They returned to the cabin, the unspoken knowledge that this might be their last night on earth hanging between them. They did not speak of fear. They did not speak of the men coming for them. Instead, they turned to each other. What happened next was not lovemaking. It was a desperate claiming, an act of defiance against the cold, violent world that waited outside their door. They came together with a raw, unfiltered passion, a furious protest against the dawn that was coming to tear them apart. In the flickering firelight, their bodies became a testament to the life they had found, a life they would not surrender without a fight. Every touch, every kiss, was a declaration. We are here. We are alive. We are ours. Love became their final, desperate protest. The attack came with the first gray light of dawn, a shout from the trees, then the splintering crash of the cabin's single window. A torch was thrown inside, landing on the dry floorboards, which erupted in hungry flames. The smell of smoke, thick and oily, filled the air. Eli was already moving. He grabbed his rifle and pulled Clara toward the small back door, the one they had always kept barred. As he wrenched the bar free, the front door burst inward, and the silhouette of Roy Carter, his face contorted in a mask of triumphant rage, appeared in the doorway. He saw them. A guttural roar of fury escaped his lips. Eli shoved Clara out the back door, into the frozen, pre-dawn air. "Run!" he yelled, turning to fire a single shot back into the cabin to slow them down. They plunged into the forest, the snow crunching under their boots. The world was a chaotic blur of gray trees and long, dark shadows. Behind them, shouts and the roar of the fire grew louder. The cabin, their small sanctuary, was becoming their funeral pyre. A chase began, a desperate, breathless flight through the frozen, skeletal branches of the winter woods. Gunfire erupted behind them, the crack of rifles echoing in the cold, still air. A bullet whizzed past Clara's head, so close she felt its heat. Another struck a tree beside her, sending a shower of bark and splinters into her face. Horses screamed as men on horseback tried to navigate the dense timber. They scrambled over a rocky outcrop, sliding down the other side into a shallow ravine. Eli paused, kneeling behind a fallen log, and raised his rifle, firing back at their pursuers to give them a precious few seconds. Clara huddled beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cold air burning her lungs. A man on a large black horse broke through the trees to their right, cutting off their path. He was one of the men from town, the burly one Eli had knocked down. He raised his pistol, a cruel grin on his face as he took aim at Eli's exposed back. Time seemed to slow down. Clara did not think. She did not aim. She acted. She ripped the heavy revolver from her belt, the cold steel a shocking weight in her hand. She raised it with both hands, just as Eli had shown her, thumbed back the hammer, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, its roar deafening in the quiet woods. The man on the horse jerked backward as if punched, a look of profound surprise on his face. He toppled sideways from the saddle and hit the ground with a heavy, final thud. The horse, terrified, bolted into the trees. Clara stared, her hand still holding the smoking pistol. The sickly sweet smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. A sudden, deafening silence descended where the man had been. Her first kill. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a wave of nausea and horror washing over her. Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her from her trance. "Clara, move!" He pulled her along, deeper into the ravine. The gunfire behind them intensified. As they scrambled up the far bank, Eli suddenly grunted in pain and stumbled, falling to one knee. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his coat. He had been shot. He tried to rise, but his leg buckled. The world was spinning around them. Their pursuers were closing in. For a moment, utter despair seized Clara, but then she looked at Eli's face, pale and clenched in pain, and a fierce, primal strength surged through her. He had saved her from a fire. She would not let him die in the snow. She put her shoulder under his good arm, taking his weight. "Lean on me," she commanded, her voice a raw, ragged thing she did not recognize as her own. She half dragged, half carried him, plunging deeper into the forest, away from the sounds of the hunt. They were two small, broken figures against a vast, white wilderness, half frozen, breathless, bleeding, but alive, and, for now, that was enough. The world had been reduced to a nightmare of white snow and red blood. Clara's breath tore from her lungs in ragged, burning gasps, each one a small cloud of steam in the freezing air. She half carried, half dragged Eli through the snow-choked forest, his dead weight a terrible anchor. His blood left a dark, obscene trail behind them, a map for their hunters to follow. The sounds of the posse had faded, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They had to disappear. Miles, or perhaps an eternity later. She saw it. A dark shape slumped against the side of a hill, nearly buried in snow. A shack. It was tilted and decrepit, its roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine, but it was shelter. With the last of her strength, she hauled Eli through the broken doorway and kicked it shut against the wind. The single room was tiny, filled with the debris of seasons of neglect, but it was a refuge. She eased Eli down onto the dirt floor, his head lolling to one side, his face a ghastly, waxy white. The girl who had once fainted at the sight of a pricked finger was gone forever. In her place was a woman forged in fire and ice. She tore open his coat and shirt, her hands numb with cold but steady. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder, leaving an ugly, ragged hole on both sides. She packed the wounds with snow, her mind numbly recalling some half-forgotten wisdom about cold stemming a bleed. She used his knife to shred the hem of her own petticoat, creating clean strips of linen to bind the wound tightly. He was burning with fever by nightfall. He tossed and turned on the floor, his eyes glassy and unfocused. muttering names that were not hers. "Jacob!" he cried out once, his voice filled with a boyish anguish. "Hold on, I am coming." Later, he whispered another name. "Amelia, the dogwoods are blooming." Clara sat beside him in the crushing darkness, wiping his face with snow-melted water, her heart aching with a grief that was not her own. She was seeing the ghosts that haunted him, the specters that had driven him into his lonely exile. For 3 days, she fought for his life. The battle was elemental, a struggle against cold, hunger, and the infection that was consuming him. She used his rifle to keep a small, smoky fire going with the rotten wood she tore from the shack's walls. She melted snow in a rusty tin can she found in the corner. On the second day, driven by a desperation that bordered on madness, she took his brother's revolver and ventured outside. A snowshoe hare, startled by her presence, froze for a fatal second. Her hands shook so violently she was sure she would miss. But the memory of the man on the horse, of the gun bucking in her hands, steadied her. The shot was deafening. She spent an hour skinning the small animal with his knife, her stomach churning, her mind a cold, hard knot of purpose. She boiled the meat in the tin can, creating a thin, weak broth that she forced, spoonful by spoonful, between his cracked lips. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke to find her asleep on the floor beside him, her head resting on his good arm, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion. He lay still, watching her, the memory of the past days a murky, nightmarish fog, but he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he was alive because of her. The woman sleeping beside him, the woman who had stitched his flesh and hunted for him, was not the same person he had pulled from a burning cabin. She was a force of nature in her own right. Spring came late that year, with a slow, reluctant thaw that seemed to mirror their own cautious return to life. The snow receded, revealing a world of mud and new green shoots. Eli's wound had closed, leaving a puckered, angry scar. He moved stiffly, his shoulder a constant, aching reminder of their flight. They knew they could not stay. The shack had been a temporary haven, but the world was still out there. They traveled for 2 weeks, moving cautiously, following the game trails and the high ridges, avoiding the main roads. They were a strange, ragged pair, their clothes worn and patched, their face gaunt, but their eyes held a new, shared resilience. They finally descended into a valley that held a town called Haven Creek. It was smaller than Redemption Gulch, newer, its buildings made of fresh-cut pine that still smelled of the forest. It felt different. The faces they saw on the street were weathered by work, not by judgment. This was a place for starting over. In her pocket, wrapped in a small piece of linen, Clara still had the one thing that connected her to her past life, a pair of pearl earrings and a small, gold locket her mother had given her. They were her last and only treasure. She found a mercantile run by a kind-faced man who also dealt in gold and jewelry. With her heart in her throat, she laid them on the counter. The man examined them, his eyes shrewd but not unkind. He named a price that was far less than their worth, but far more than she had ever hoped to possess. She sold her past for a handful of gold and silver coins, and she did not look back. The money was enough. They bought a small, forgotten plot of land a mile outside of town, a piece of ground that sloped down to a clear, fast-running creek. And then, together, they began to build a home. Eli, despite the ache in his shoulder, taught her how to fell the smaller pines, how to strip their bark and notch their ends. They worked from sunrise to sunset, the rhythmic thud of the axe and the rasp of the saw the only music they needed. He would work the heavier logs, his muscles straining, while she chinked the gaps with mud and moss, her once soft hands now as capable and sure as his own. During that time, something in Eli began to thaw. The permanent shadow in his eyes receded. He still walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from an old leg injury that the cold and hardship had aggravated. But he began to smile. It would happen at unexpected moments. He would watch her struggling to lift a log, her face a mask of concentration, and a slow, quiet smile would touch his lips. He would smile at the sight of the walls of their cabin rising, a solid testament to their shared labor. The sound of his laughter, a low, rusty sound from disuse, was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever heard. One day, a year after they had settled, a traveling peddler passed through Haven Creek, his wagon laden with news as much as with goods, as Clara was buying thread. She overheard him talking to the mercantile owner. He spoke of a fire down in the next territory, at a big ranch owned by a man named Carter. "Burned to the ground," the peddler said, his voice full of grim satisfaction. "They say he was a mean one. Story is, he was drunk, stumbled with a lantern in the barn, never found the body. The whole place went up like a tinderbox. Just him and that grim housekeeper of his. Good riddance," most folks said. Clara stood frozen, the spools of thread clutched in her hand. She paid for her goods and walked home in a daze. She found Eli by the creek, reinforcing the bank with stones. She told him the news, her voice flat and emotionless. He stopped his work and looked out across the water, his face unreadable. There was no celebration, no triumph. There was only the quiet, heavy finality of a chapter closing. The ghost that had pursued them was finally gone, consumed by the very element he had used as a weapon. That night, Clara took out the old leather ledger she had used as her journal. By the light of a tallow candle, she wrote one last entry. She filled the pages with their story, from the stagecoach ride to the shack in the snow, from the building of their home to the news of Roy's death. She did not spare the ugly details, nor did she hold back on the quiet, fierce love that had grown in the wilderness. On the final page, she wrote, "If you find this in a time long after we are gone, know that we lived. Know that we were broken, and that we healed each other. Know we loved, even when we were not allowed to." The next day, she wrapped the ledger in a piece of oiled canvas. They were finishing the stone hearth, the heart of their small home, before Eli set the final, large hearthstone in place. She knelt and placed the journal deep in the foundation. He understood. He gently placed the stone over it, sealing their story in the very foundations of the life they had built. They were burying the past, not to forget it, but to build upon it. Years passed. The small cabin became a home. A garden flourished by the creek. The harsh lines on their faces softened. One golden afternoon in late summer, they sat together on the small porch they had added to the front of the cabin. The air was warm and smelled of pine and wildflowers. Distant clouds, white and harmless, gathered over the mountains. Clara leaned her head against Eli's shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. She watched the setting sun cast a fiery glow upon the clouds. "I am not afraid of fire anymore," she whispered. He put his arm around her and held her close. The fire no longer held any power over her. It was just a color in the sky, a warmth in the hearth, a part of the world that was both beautiful and dangerous, but no longer a monster. As dusk began to settle, painting the valley in soft shades of purple and gray, Eli stood and held out his hand to her. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. There, on the small wooden porch, with the crickets beginning their evening song, they began to dance. There was no music. They moved slowly, in perfect time with each other, a quiet, swaying rhythm that was their own. The wild world, with its fires and its storms, its cruelty and its laws, was still all around them, but it was no longer inside them. They had found their peace, not in a town or on a map, but in the small, sacred space they held in each other's arms. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others, and to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.